Like most other Jews, I've watched the situation in Egypt the last few weeks with interest. I'm not only anxious to see what happens in Egypt now that Mubarak is gone, but I also have some concerns about how the changes will affect Israel. I would think that most Americans my age and older would hear about the protests and the violence in the Middle East right now and think back to our own country in the 60s. My generation elevated protesting to an art form. As a result, we ended a war and gave civil rights to minorities. The bad thing is that the comparisons stop there. When Americans organized protests, we had our Constitution behind us, giving us the right to do it. And the changes we were lobbying for were also backed by our Constitution. That isn't true in Egypt, and it is even less true in Libya, where another violent protest is beginning. What is frightening in those countries is the very real possibility that what they get after getting rid of a dictator might be worse than what they had before. If that happens, what recourse do they have to change it except more death and more violence? I have to confess that I have watched the situation with just a bit of nostalgia and envy. I admit that I'm an overaged hippie and I miss being part of a group of people who care so passionately about a cause. Any cause. I miss having people see something that is wrong and rebelling against that wrong. The two generations that have been born since the 60s are very different from us. Visiting a college campus almost makes me sad now. Instead of young people preparing for themselves to make a better world, we have whole generations whose primary goal for adulthood is to see how much money they can make, how many possessions they can accumulate, and how much status they can achieve in their careers. There's nothing wrong with those goals, but they should be interspersed with making the world a better place, and I don't see that happening very often in our country anymore. Now when someone doesn't like something, they fire off a few emails to their friends and retreat back into comfortable complacency. Think about Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. If that happened in the 60s, the city would have been full of college students volunteering to help with the recovery. In their spare time, they would have been protesting against the substandard construction that allowed Lake Pontchartrain to breach the levees. Now, unfortunately, the reaction of most people was to watch the disaster on TV and say, that's too bad. If they did anything, they mailed a check and considered the job done. One of the few things that distressed me about the 60s was the lack of support that our military people received. They deserve 100% of our backing 100% of the time, and they didn't get it then because we disagreed with the war they were sent to fight. That was wrong. Today we have a better understanding that it is our military personnel who see the world's wrongs and are willing to risk their lives to correct them while defending our right to be the complacent society that we have become. I sometimes wonder if our lack of interest in helping anyone but ourselves comes from the declining level of religious convictions that so many of our young people have. Religious beliefs teach us to care. Just about every major religion represented in our country reports a drastic reduction in their numbers, especially among young members. With each generation, that gets worse. Very few young people adopt religious values as an adult if they weren't taught them as a child. And those children certainly won't teach their children what they themselves never heard. We long-haired, tie-dyed, change-demanding radicals might have caused our parents a few sleepless nights, maybe a lot of sleepless nights, but we cared. And it was our 1940s World War II parents who taught us how to care. That generation never looked the other way. Here in America, Italian Catholics, Scotch Presbyterians, Orthodox Russians, people of all backgrounds put their lives on hold to spend 4 years helping to save the Jewish people from a dictator that wanted to annihilate us. I'm sorry to say that probably wouldn't happen now. Americans would sit in their $300,000 houses in front of their 42-inch TVs, watch Jews being marched into the ovens and say, somebody ought to do something about that. Then they would turn on American Idol and forget it. I've heard the comment that most of the Middle Eastern countries are about 200 years behind us. While that is bad from a perspective of human rights, health, and education, it might be a good thing in terms of attitude. Right now, their young people are feeling the same longing for freedom that we did when we were being oppressed by the British, and they are willing to fight for it. They've got a rocky road ahead of them. Yes, we are right to worry about what will happen in Israel, but we should also be caring about what will happen to the people in Egypt and Libya. Too many of us think about what some radical Muslims have done to us, and we tend to assume that all of them are the same. They aren't. The Muslims I know personally are ordinary people who want to raise their family and pursue their careers in peace, just like the rest of us. They deserve the help and support from the free world, just as we Jews needed and deserved it when we were oppressed by the Nazis. Let's try not to be so complacent in our own freedom that we decide other people's suffering is not our problem. The children are watching us. If we don't care, they won't care either.